What's up, guys, and welcome back to Tech Plant. The plant room is disheveled, I'm disheveled, but the experiment is rock solid. We're going to be checking out some aquarium substrate used for anthuriums. Let's check it out.
Alright, so like all experiment videos, we have to introduce our subjects. We are going to be doing tests on anthuriums for this one. It's a pretty varied set in my opinion. We have our nice velvet anthurium, we have a more bird's nest anthurium, and then a really epiphytic one, which is the gracile. These are really great in just like almost like orchid substrate and stuff. They really like to grow in trees and stuff, so I think it's a good mix. Maybe I haven't really introduced this experiment yet. The intro might have kind of hinted at it, but we're going to be using an aquarium substrate this time. There is a lot of hype around fluval, like aqua soil or whatever they call it. I've been using it in the aquariums for quite a while, and I think it works fine. However, the longer it exists wet, the faster it just kind of like turns into mud. So I'm trying something that's a little different. And this one is called Seachem. One of the major differences between this and fluval is this is actually just like a clay, like a hardened clay, almost like broken terracotta pieces, if you want to imagine it that way. And so it's a little more porous, it's breathable, and it is a little heavy, but you can reuse this stuff. It doesn't like break down into mud. So I'm a bigger fan of things you can reuse a lot, because fluval is really expensive. So in order to get this experiment set up, we do have to get 3 of the plants down to bare roots, and that being 1 of each, because we're going to transplant it in the flourite, and I really want to get rid of the soil the best I can, just to sort of do a comparison between what I usually grow my aeroids in versus the Seachem. So this is kind of how we have to start it. I'm rinsing it off the best I can just to try and get it as close as I can to being just pure Seachem flourite versus just the regular soil mix. And that soil mix that I usually use is a very like peat. There's some regular dirt in there, a lot of perlite, a little bit of sphagnum moss, and just kind of whatever I've recycled over time. Once I've got them all clean, I am just going to get them buried quite nice. I'm almost covering the crown of these anthuriums. I've experimented with this a little bit prior to this video, so I have a general idea of how well it's going to work and like its properties. So this stuff dries out pretty good, but it stays moist as well and breathes really well, so I'm not too worried about like putting a lot over the crown. And I'll probably shake it up a bit, and as I water it, it'll get moved around a little bit, so this should be good. So all that's left then is just to add some water to this stuff. Again, because it's basically like a clay gravel, you can really saturate it a lot, honestly. All the excess water is going to run out, and the clay should just soak up what it needs. The very first watering, a lot of dust comes out. You are supposed to rinse this bag for when you use it in aquariums, but I don't care about the dust. It'll run its way out. It's just clay dust, so I don't mind it. Then, like always, all my experiments are under grow lights, so I just put all 6 plants in the same spot under some grow lights, and we just have to give them time. Alright, this is going to be the longest gap of time ever. An entire 8 months has passed. I started this back in October, and this would be like about June, I think, so I'm pretty sure my math is right. But here's how they're looking so far. I'm not going to dig these up just yet. We're going to give it a little bit longer, but I just wanted to show you kind of where they're at after 8 whole months. Now, honestly, they don't look a whole lot different. They haven't been growing super fast. You would think for 8 months you'd see a lot of like insane growth, but they have grown quite a bit. They have lost leaves over time. It's just really hard to see in the comparison. I would say they've probably grown like 4 or 5 new leaves maybe. I'm not really sure. But the rate in which things are growing in my collection is not important. It's actually just the rate in which they're growing compared to my regular substrate, right? That's kind of what we're going for with this experiment. And honestly, I don't see much of a difference. They are looking pretty similar, which is a good sign. When looking up close at the gracile, I can see both have matured properly. They've both produced berries. The only real difference I see is the Seachem has a lot more big surface roots, whereas the soil one not so much. So maybe because I didn't bury them up as high with the soil on the other one, but it seems like the plant stayed a lot more like short, if that makes sense, in the Seachem. I'm not really 100% on that. With the Magnificum, this is a velvet anthurium, and this one was actually surprising. It seems like the Seachem is not doing as well. It's a little bit behind, and the leaves are a little smaller, and my soil substrate is working a little better. When looking at the Etropropia, or whatever the heck it's called, this one is more of a bird's nest one. There's almost no difference actually between these two, and they look a little bleached. I've been noticing this in a few more of these because I have quite a few, and the leaves are getting that real bleached look. Usually these are growing like in the undergrowth of like a jungle or something. They really are in low light situations doing pretty well, so I think I'm hammering with too much light. But overall, growth seems the same across both substrates. Let's put them back under those grow lights, bleach them some more, and see how they're doing a little later. Alright, about another 2 months has passed. I think that puts us at 10 months for this entire experiment on this substrate. Let's take a closer look this time. I definitely, after looking at them from like a little further out and just comparing the top, I do want to dig all of them up and really check on the root difference, because I'm really curious what it looks like underneath the substrate, because we can see the top growth quite plainly and it looked pretty similar, but I want to see if there's any differences underground. Here's a few comparisons then where I'm just showing you the foliage, and I would say it's pretty hard to pick out a clear winner. Some may be one leaf ahead or the other, but it's really hard to say if this is due to the substrate or the actual plant in my care. Because I didn't do a great number in this experiment, it's really hard to like rule that as like an actual success in either direction. So I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that they're pretty darn similar in performance as far as foliage is concerned, except for one, which would be that velvet anthurium. That magnificum has truly done, I would say, worse in this substrate. It does not seem to be a big fan of it. However, it has grown okay. It just hasn't been pushing out the same size leaves or the growth that I've seen like consistently in my regular, like what I would call my aeroid substrate. So I am going to say that this is a loss for the Seachem with these velvet anthuriums, but again, it is one plant and it's really hard to put that much emphasis on this, so take it with a grain of salt. One surface level difference I did notice, and it's especially apparent with the gracile, is the surface level roots, and I can actually say that there is quite a difference between the two substrates because all three plants across the three species seem to do this. There was a huge preference on roots on the surface of this gravel versus the regular soil ones or my aeroid substrate, where you can't really see a lot of those roots hit the surface. The gracile is especially noticeable, but you can even notice this one in the bird's nest anthurium, and there's even some very small ones peeking up on the magnificum. I'm wondering if that's just because of the weight of the soil, or if it held moisture and was really breathable, where the humidity was just right or something to really draw those upper roots up and down. Because even with the other stuff, you can see that they started, but they just didn't want to like keep growing, if that makes sense. But the Seachem, they went crazy on the surface of the substrate. So just a really odd observation. I'm guessing we saw a lot of surface roots with the Seachem because it's much heavier and a lot harder for these plants to push roots into, but we'll see now that we can dump it out and really analyze the roots below. I'm also going to dig up the ones that are in my like dirt just to kind of see what the real difference is. It would make sense to see both, and we can that way get a better picture and a better comparison. So as I'm dumping these out and cleaning the dirt off, I'm not seeing any major differences right away. Again, I'm obviously seeing the very obvious like upper roots that were really prevalent on the Seachem ones on all three species. There's quite a bit there, but I am seeing some lower roots. Again, a lot of these could be more of the older roots that were already buried, so it's hard to say if like the plant realized that it was like being crushed to death and it decided to put a lot of upper roots out. I'm not really sure exactly, but it has been very interesting characteristics. Now that they're really cleaned up, or I shouldn't say really cleaned up, they're cleaned up as good as I'm going to get it, and we kind of analyze this, I think we're starting to really see a pattern here. I'm noticing with the soil, there seems to be a lot more root growth underground, and then when I look at the ones that were in the Seachem, it doesn't look like there was a significant amount of roots produced underground, and we're seeing a lot more bigger, robust roots towards the very tops of the plant. So that really makes me think that these are really struggling to grow in that really heavy soil or substrate. It's not really a soil. Again, it's little crushed pieces of clay. And so I'm guessing that the reason we saw such a burst of like energy on the top is because it was much easier for the roots to grow outside of the substrate and just like adhere to the top and suck the water off of that than it was to dig around underneath that heavy Seachem, because honestly the pots are really heavy. You could almost weight lift with them. Looking at the magnificum, it really confirmed it too for me, because there's hardly any roots on the Seachem one versus the one in soil that has done so much better is just jam-packed with roots. So I'm guessing it struggled because it really doesn't put out those like really big auxiliary, I don't want to call them auxiliary roots, but the upper roots, you really don't see many on magnificum or even velvet anthuriums anyways, and it's more of the bird nest or epiphytic ones that really put out those like big roots towards like the base, you know. So it kind of explains why we saw what we saw. Another set of evidence that really starts to make this picture clear is looking at the roots really close. You can see a lot of the roots have a lot of dents, and they're very like jagged looking. They're not very smooth. You can see how the heaviness of the gravel really pushed into them and really forced them to adhere to basically the cracks within like the substrate, if that makes sense. The roots don't look nearly nice and round like you do see from the soil ones. So again, I think the weight of the substrate was a little too much. I'm not going to end the experiment here because I do want to see like what we're looking at long term, like a year, 2 years. So I'm going to repot these up. I'm also going to add a little fertilizer in there with them, some, I forget what it's called. It's like this little pellet. It's Osmocote. That's what it's called. So we'll get them potted up and just keep this experiment going. However, I'm not going to compare them anymore to the soil. I think we've seen the results here, and we're just going to see long-term what the Seachem's capable of. I do have some bonus clips here of one of my most precious plants. This is my Encephalium hybrid, and I've had this in Seachem for probably a year and a half at least, so we can at least, maybe even longer. I did this way before the experiment, but this is really compelling stuff here. The plastic pot on this one is just bulging in every direction. It is ridiculously tight and just insane. So let's cut this open and see what's inside. The roots are absolutely insane on this plant, and you're about to see something wild. When I tip this plant up, as I shake all the substrate out, you'll notice something very peculiar, and this really points to the whole idea that I think we're seeing here. The inside of this pot is completely hollow with roots. There are some, but they're like the previous ones that were potted up. Every single new root on this thing is on the very outside. So basically this substrate, I think, is a little too heavy for these plants, and what they end up doing is really chasing the outside of the pot where they can fit between the like flimsy plastic and the heavy gravel. I can't hardly see anything on the center. So my guess is with a lot of plants and this heavy substrate is it's a little too much for these thick roots to push through. It gets to be a little too sharp, a little too heavy, and these thicker roots aren't going to make it. I think plants with really hair-like roots that can really weave in and out of the smaller like gaps would probably do well, but for anything with thick roots like this, I think it's going to be a struggle. Now, not to say that Seachem hasn't worked, because it has worked wonders, and you could see all those roots in the Seachem look perfect. There is not a single sign of rot. There is not a single sign of brown. The one thing that this really excels with is the water retention is absolutely perfect. It is super breathable, super porous. Even though I could water the heck out of these things day in and day out, it didn't matter. It will always do really well, and you could see that in how nice and white and pretty those roots are. However, they still struggle to grow through it. So I think Seachem is great for certain plants that you may overwater all the time and kill, because this stuff is so breathable and it works so well. However, it is just a little too heavy, I think, and a lot of your root growth is going to be around the perimeter of the pot, and maybe that's not a problem. But I hope this experiment kind of gave you a better idea of how Seachem might perform for your plants, and maybe you'll use some, mix it into your substrates, or who knows. But that should be pretty helpful.
Well guys, that pretty much sums up this video. I hope you enjoyed this experiment. I've probably got some pretty interesting videos coming up soon here. Doing a lot of rearranging. My plants just keep getting bigger. I don't know what to do. They're taking over, but it's a lot of fun. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed that experiment. I got a few other cool ones with different substrates coming up, but I thought this one was pretty neat. I like the results, and I'm probably going to try and incorporate this into some other plants of mine. I hope you guys like this, and as always, may your plants go strong and healthy. I'll see you next time.